Well, welcome back, Full Send family, to week number 2 in our series on 1 Corinthians, entitled Cracks in the Walls. We're looking at the things in the church that, when we're not built on Christ, can raise up and cause issues within our church. Last week we talked about leadership, of how churches can fall in love with certain leaders, and Paul is saying it's not about the one who is leading at the church. It is about making sure we are following Christ. I'm sure many of us can think of a pastor that we love, and that's fine as long as it doesn't take place of loving and following Christ first. Today we're going to look at the community of believers and some things that can get into the cracks of the church there. And we're starting at chapter 11 and then chapter 12. And I hope you've read this, but if you haven't, I encourage you to read it. And I want to explain a little something to you. In chapter 11, it talks about head coverings. And we're not as familiar with head coverings today, but it talks about both men and women and what they are or are not to wear on their heads. And it's different, right? But they both are approved to pray and prophesy in the church. Just it has to be done in a way that is correct. Now, for the women, they were to put something on their head. They were to have a head covering. And in this culture, in this context, a head covering meant that they were in a covenantal marriage with a man. And so if they were to come in to the church or even walk the streets without a head covering, it would be as if a woman today would take off her wedding ring and go downtown, and it would show availability and not that they were in a covenantal marriage with a man. And so they were disrespecting their husband, disrespecting the covenant of marriage by taking off the head covering in that culture. And for the men, it said that they were not to have head coverings on. And the reason it said that was because in that context, the pagan worshipers would put stuff on their head as to say, look at me, I am great, I am good at worshiping, I am wonderful at all I do. And it was pointing to themselves and this pride. And so Paul says, don't be like the pagans. Don't draw attention to yourself. No, when you pray and when you prophesy, make sure you do so to point to God. And so Paul was telling the early church, don't make time together about yourself. Make it about God. Continue on in the passage, it talks about the Lord's Supper. And again, in this passage, in verse 17, it says, but in following instructions, I do not commend you, because when you come together, it is not for the better, but for the worse. For in the first place, when you come together as a church, I hear there are divisions among you, and I believe it in part. For there must be factions among you in order that those who are genuine among you may be recognized. When you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper that you eat. For in eating, one goes ahead with his own meal, and one goes hungry. Another drinks and gets drunk, while others go thirsty. This is a problem in the early church, where the rich, they didn't have to work as much because they were already wealthy. But the poor, they had to work long hours. And oftentimes the church would meet at night. And so the rich would come early and they would eat and they would drink and they would be extravagant. And by the time the poor got off of work to come and join the gathering together, everything was gone. And nothing was left for those who actually needed food and drink. And so Paul talks against this. He says, do not do this. This is not what the church should be. Do not be about your own selfish desires, but care for the whole body. He says, in fact, what are we doing when we celebrate the Lord's Supper? We're celebrating his sacrifice. He said to be a servant to all. We cannot celebrate the Lord's Supper when we are selfishly promoting our own desires instead of looking out for the needs of others. And so at the end of chapter 11, it says, so then, my brothers, when you come to eat, wait for one another. If anyone is hungry, let him eat at home, so that when you come together, it will not be for judgment. About the other things, I will give you directions when I come. He said, If you're going to become hangry before everybody can get there, then have a snack before you come. But wait till everybody gets there so that you can come together as one body, joining together around the meal, celebrating and remembering what Jesus Christ has done. He says sometimes in community, the crack we have in our church is that we are so consumed with our own needs, our own desires, our own wants, and we don't care for the whole community, the orphans, the widows, the poor. And the final part of this section is chapter 12, and it talks about spiritual gifts. In chapter 12, he talks about how all the gifts are from one Spirit. And then he goes into talking about how we are the body and how each part of the body is necessary. Yeah, some might be quote unquote more important or will do different things, but every part is necessary. It seems as if in this church it became a competition of which gifts people would use or have, instead of saying we need every gift. God gives you a gift, He gives me a gift, He gives them a gift, and they are to be used faithfully for the betterment of the whole body. There is not one that is better, there is not one that is lesser. They are all necessary. And so Paul is saying, hey, don't compete when it comes to gifts, but just simply use the gift God has given you for His body, for His church. So we see here this community of believers who is struggling because their foundation wasn't focused on Christ, it was focused on other things. Again, we saw at first that they were focused on pointing to themselves rather than to God. Well, I want to do it this way, or I want to look this way, rather than saying, this is about God. People don't need to look to me. And the second part, they were looking out for their own desires and not for the needs of those around them. They were struggling in church because they were selfish and not selfless. And then they were struggling in church because they were competing rather than working in unity as a healthy body. I wonder what it looks like in your church. Is your church a full send church, 100% committed to Jesus Christ? Not to their own desires, not to their passions, not to what they want? But are they seeking to point people to Jesus? Are they seeking to take care of those who are in need? And are they seeking to join together rather than to compete against each other and even other churches? For we are one body in Christ, all believers, working together for the kingdom. May we all be a part of full send churches that are 100% committed to Christ and Christ alone.